They called her Helpless, but in the dark corner of that filthy alien auction pit, Cassie Hale sat cross-legged with a calm so unnerving that even the guards stopped sneering, their laughter drying in their throats, as the shadows seemed to lean closer toward her. One of them, a sneering green-skinned brute with tusks that jutted past his lower lip, muttered that humans broke easily, that she'd scream soon enough like all the others had, but Cassie merely smiled and whispered to the darkness behind her, shadows twisting where none should be. That was the hook, the moment everything began unraveling, because those shadows answered her in a voice no one else could hear and promised her vengeance in a language older than stars. The heat of the auction pit was unbearable, filled with the stench of sweat and hopelessness as creatures from every corner of the galaxy were chained and displayed like trophies. Vorik, captain of the slaver vessel Iron Claw, strutted among them, bellowing bids and insults in equal measure. When he reached Cassie, he didn't bother disguising his contempt, proclaiming her frail frame a waste of iron cuffs. But even as he laughed, his shadow stretched a little too long behind him, and for just a flicker of a moment, its fingers curled toward her of their own accord. Cassie's gaze swept the crowd of slavers, pirates, and opportunists gathered for the auction. Her face was smudged with dirt, hair tangled and clothes torn, the very image of a victim ready to be owned and transported to some distant mining moon. But inside, her heart beat steady, and her mind calculated every detail around her. She listened carefully as Velis, the alien prisoner chained next to her, muttered in a language she somehow understood, his voice trembling as he warned her about Vorik's brutality, and how humans never lasted long on his ship. She simply nodded and told Velis he worried too much for a dead man. Velis frowned, confused, until Cassie leaned in and whispered that the shadows were hungry tonight. Within minutes the deal was struck. Vorik paid an insulting sum for her, hardly believing his luck that no one else wanted to bid on the pathetic human. She was dragged from the auction cage, her wrists shackled, and thrown onto the Iron Claw along with a dozen others destined for the markets of Karen Prime. As the ship lifted off and the auction site disappeared into the stars, Cassie sat quietly, observing everything, her hands relaxed in her cuffs, her eyes alert and calculating. Velis was placed beside her in the dark, grimy hold of the slave deck. His scales glistened faintly in the dim red light, and he seemed to have recovered some of his composure. He leaned toward her, speaking softly, telling her about dead space, the sector of darkness Vorik would soon cross to shorten his route, a place where whole fleets vanished without a trace. Cassie nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the cold metal floor beneath her, as if feeling the ship's heartbeat. Velis didn't understand why she was so calm, why she was smiling at the mention of such a terrifying place. Meanwhile, Vorik was celebrating his haul in his private quarters, drinking foul-smelling alien liquor and boasting to his crew about how weak and amusing humans were. He laughed loudly, recounting how Earth's fall had been inevitable, how humanity had scattered like insects across the stars, begging for mercy they didn't deserve. In the shadows of his chamber, the darkness seemed to thicken. His reflection in the polished metal wall flickered oddly, its eyes too deep, too dark, as if something else stared back from within it. Back in the hold, Velis continued talking, this time explaining Vorik's cruelty in detail, how he enjoyed tormenting his captives, breaking them mentally before they were sold. Cassie listened patiently, her mind elsewhere, because she could feel it now, the ship had entered dead space. The lights dimmed slightly, as if the darkness outside the hull was pressing inward. A cold draft swept through the chamber and Velis shivered visibly. Cassie didn't shiver at all. Suddenly, Grush, Vorik's hulking second-in-command, appeared outside the cage, leering down at her and thumping the bars with his club. He roared that tonight she would entertain Vorik personally, that he liked breaking the weak ones himself. The other prisoners averted their gaze, afraid to witness another helpless soul's demise. But Cassie raised her head slowly, meeting Grush's yellow eyes directly, and whispered a single sentence that made even Velis recoil, "Tell your captain the shadows are waiting." Grush laughed and unlocked the cage door, grabbing Cassie roughly and dragging her down the dark corridor toward Vorik's quarters. Her bare feet scraped the floor, but her expression remained calm, her lips curling into a faint smile as the shadows lining the corridor rippled and slid silently across the walls. Guards lining the passageway didn't notice the shifting darkness, didn't see the faint glimmer of eyes that blinked once and then vanished back into the gloom. As Grush reached Vork's door, Cassie tilted her head toward the corner and said softly, not to Grush but to something unseen, now. Without a sound, Grush froze. His breath caught in his throat as a long, ink-black tendril emerged from the shadow beneath the door, wrapping around his leg and pulling him with terrifying force into the darkness. His strangled cry was muffled almost instantly. Cassie stood where he had left her, staring at the door calmly, brushing dust from her shoulder. Inside the quarters, Vork was still laughing at his own cruel jokes when the door creaked open. He turned, expecting Grush to shove the pathetic human girl inside. Instead, Cassie stepped in alone. Vork roared in anger, demanding to know where his lieutenant was, but she ignored him, walking slowly toward the center of the room. Shadows clung unnaturally to the corners, seeming to pulse with life as she moved. Vork reached for his blaster, but the weapon was yanked from his hand by an unseen force, disappearing into a pool of shadow on the floor. Then she spoke, and her voice was cold and clear. "I told you they were waiting." The darkness answered her words. Vork barely had time to scream as the shadows surged forward, wrapping around him like a living tide. Cassie watched dispassionately, her expression unreadable as her captor was consumed whole. The shadows receded as quickly as they had risen, leaving no trace of Vork behind. Cassie sat on the captain's chair, looking around the room that was now hers. She leaned back, her fingers drumming on the armrest as the ship's lights flickered and dimmed again, the darkness now an ally rather than a threat. She turned toward the nearest camera and smiled, whispering just loud enough for the ship's recording system to catch her words. "They thought I was helpless. They thought wrong." The iron claw drifted deeper into dead space, its engines humming uneasily as if the ship itself sensed it had crossed an invisible threshold where light and reason faltered. In the slave hold, Cassie sat alone now, her wrists still shackled but her posture entirely relaxed, even regal. The other prisoners watched her with a mixture of fear and awe, none daring to speak first. Only Veles finally broke the silence, his reptilian eyes narrowing as he leaned closer and whispered that Vork was gone, that Grush had vanished as well, and that no one understood what was happening. Cassie simply smiled and said they would all understand soon enough, but they might not enjoy it. Veles hesitated before asking the question that hung in the air, "What are you?" Cassie did not answer directly. Instead, she turned her gaze to the shadows pooling under the grated floor, watching as they slithered and pulsed with anticipation. The ship's lights flickered again, and an unsettling groan echoed through the hall as if dead space itself was pressing its weight against the fragile metal walls. Veles shifted uncomfortably, trying to mask his fear with a conspiratorial grin. He told Cassie he had a plan, that now was the perfect moment to act, with Vork dead and the crew distracted and afraid. He offered her an alliance, promising that together they could take control of the ship and sell the vessel for unimaginable wealth. Cassie tilted her head curiously, asking how Veles knew the slaver codes and flight controls. Veles flashed a crooked smile, admitting that he was not just any prisoner but an informant planted by Vork to spy on troublesome slaves. Before Cassie could reply, he leaned even closer and whispered that he could show her how to override the security systems if she removed his cuffs first. The irony of Veles' offer made Cassie laugh softly. The sound was not cruel but unsettling in its calmness. She told him there was no need to override anything, that the ship already belonged to her. Veles frowned, confused and growing more suspicious. He asked how she could possibly control the vessel without codes, without even access to the bridge. Cassie reached out with one finger and tapped the metal floor. As if summoned, the shadows rippled outward from beneath her, crawling up the walls and into the ceiling panels. Above them, distant screams began to echo from the upper decks as crew members found themselves hunted by things they could neither see nor fight. Veles' smile vanished, replaced by terror as realization dawned that Cassie was not just another victim, not just another human prisoner, but something else entirely, something that the shadows obeyed. In the corridor outside, the few remaining guards barked frantic orders, their weapons trained on every dark corner, their fingers twitching nervously on triggers that would do them no good. The ship's lights continued to flicker and dim, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move even when nothing was there. One guard, trembling, insisted that he saw something slithering along the ceiling. Another cursed him for losing his mind. A third screamed as an unseen force dragged him into a ventilation shaft, his weapon clattering to the floor in a pool of spreading darkness. On the bridge, the officer left in charge activated emergency protocols, desperately trying to reroute power and send distress signals. But every command he entered was met with silence from the system, or worse, cryptic responses that made no sense. Then, as he pounded the console in frustration, a new voice spoke through the ship's speakers. It was Cassie's voice, calm and measured, telling them that their captain was gone, that their lieutenant was gone, and that their ship was no longer theirs. The bridge crew froze, looking around in horror as the shadows crept toward them, ignoring locked doors and security fields alike. Back in the slave hold, Velis backed away from Cassie, panic now fully replacing his earlier bravado. He begged her to let him go, to spare him because he had tried to help her. Cassie stood slowly, the cuffs on her wrists falling away as if unlocked by invisible hands. She walked toward Velis, her expression unreadable, and told him that his betrayal had been obvious from the start. She said she had let him speak, let him make his offers, because it amused her to watch him try to manipulate her when it was already far too late. Velis fell to his knees, pleading now, promising loyalty, riches, anything she wanted if she would let him live. Cassie crouched in front of him, meeting his wide, terrified eyes. She reached out and gently touched his cheek, almost kindly, before whispering that she did not need loyalty or riches. All she needed was for the shadows to be fed. As soon as the words left her lips, the darkness surged from beneath the floor, wrapping around Velis and pulling him into the black, silencing his screams as quickly as they had begun. The other prisoners watched in stunned silence, none daring to move. Cassie turned to them, her gaze sweeping over each of them carefully. She told them they were free now, but warned them that freedom came with a price. She said they could leave if they wished, but if any of them tried to betray her, the shadows would know and would come for them too. The weight of her words settled heavily over them, and one by one, they nodded silently, understanding that their lives now depended entirely on her mercy. Cassie made her way through the corridors, the shadows clearing her path and swallowing any crew who dared to stand in her way. When she reached the bridge, the last of Vorik's officers tried to fire at her, their weapons discharging harmlessly into pools of living black that absorbed every shot. She stepped calmly onto the command deck and sat in the captain's chair, her small frame dwarfed by the high back seat but her presence undeniable. The ship's systems flickered back to life as if acknowledging their new master. Cassie leaned forward, resting her elbows on the armrests, and spoke softly to the ship's AI, telling it to plot a course deeper into dead space. The AI hesitated at first, citing dangers and protocols, but the shadows curling along the control panels seemed to convince it otherwise. As the iron claw turned away from known space, Cassie felt the shadows settle around her like a cloak. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the silence, knowing that this was just the beginning. Her enemies had thought her helpless, had laughed at her weakness, but they would soon learn the truth. They would learn that in the dark, the shadows belonged to her, and that she was coming for all of them. The iron claw slipped further into dead space, its engines humming low and strained as though the vast darkness outside was pressing down on the ship itself. In the command chair, Cassie sat still, eyes half closed, feeling every vibration, every ripple of unease that coursed through the metal under her feet. The shadows, her shadows, swirled lazily around her, brushing against the consoles, dimming the overhead lights further until the entire bridge seemed bathed in twilight. The few surviving crew members huddled at their stations, speaking in whispers, terrified to look directly at her but more terrified to disobey. They had seen what happened to those who defied her, and their loyalty now came from sheer survival instinct rather than duty. As the ship advanced, dead space revealed its true nature. Beyond the viewports, flickering ghostly shapes twisted and danced in the void. Sometimes they looked like ships, derelicts long lost, and sometimes they looked like vast predatory creatures circling, waiting for weakness. The ship's sensors flickered constantly, reporting impossible readings that made no sense even to the hardened bridge crew who had once laughed at ancient stories about dead space. Cassie alone remained calm, her face illuminated by the pale light of the console displays, her fingers occasionally brushing the controls though she barely needed to touch anything. The shadows obeyed her thoughts now, her will bending the very environment around her. Below deck, the remaining prisoners who had chosen to follow her sat in uneasy silence. Some clung to the idea that she was their liberator, but others feared they had simply traded one captor for another more terrifying. Whispers spread among them that Cassie had made a deal with a demon, that she was a witch conjuring ancient darkness, that she had sacrificed Velis to some unseen god of shadows. They avoided meeting her gaze whenever she passed, eyes lowered, breaths held as she walked by. In the engineering section, chaos reigned. Vorok's former crew tried desperately to stabilize power fluctuations and maintain life support, but systems failed at random, consoles sparked without warning, and entire corridors seemed to warp and stretch as if the ship itself was twisting in unseen hands. The chief engineer, a grizzled alien with 6 arms, muttered curses under his breath, blaming the humans for bringing bad luck. His crew worked in terrified silence, aware that their tools no longer obeyed them as they should. A spanner left on a console would vanish into the shadows, reappearing somewhere else moments later. A coil of cable would writhe and twist as if alive, tightening suddenly around a worker's ankle or throat when they weren't looking. Cassie watched all this unfold on the monitors from the bridge, her expression unreadable. She was no longer simply planning an escape, she was asserting dominion over the Iron Claw itself, transforming it into something new. Her mind stretched beyond her body now, connected to every flicker of shadow and every ripple of darkness on the ship. The Shadow Keeper whispered in her thoughts, guiding her, teaching her how to bend dead space itself to her will. She had glimpsed her grandmother's secret in those whispers, realizing that her family had not merely survived in the galaxy but had once ruled the darkness from which all feared to tread. That bloodline flowed through her, awakening now in full. A shrill alarm cut through the bridge's eerie quiet as an automated distress signal began flashing on one of the consoles. The crew froze in panic, but Cassie waved one hand lazily and the shadows smothered the sound immediately. She leaned forward, examining the signal. A Kartan warship, Vorok's former allies, was nearby, answering a silent beacon Vorok had activated before his death. Cassie smiled slightly, realizing they would come expecting to find a helpless human captive aboard an out-of-control slaver ship. Instead, they would find her. Her voice, calm and soft but impossible to ignore, broke the silence as she ordered the bridge crew to open a communication channel. The crew hesitated, but the shadows pressed against them, curling around their throats gently but firmly until they obeyed. The screen flickered to life and a scarred Kartan warlord appeared, sneering with amusement at the sight of Cassie sitting alone on the bridge. He demanded to know where Vorok was and what had happened to his ship. Cassie tilted her head and smiled, saying simply that Vorok had been consumed and that his ship now sailed under new command. The warlord's sneer turned into a growl as he threatened to board the Iron Claw, to reclaim the cargo, and punish anyone who defied Kartan law. Cassie did not reply immediately. Instead, she reached out and tapped the console with one finger. Outside, in the void, the shadows coiled and writhed, invisible to the warlord's sensors but not to her eyes. They gathered around the warship, slithering through the cold darkness as if savoring the moment before striking. Then she spoke, her voice dropping into a tone cold enough to freeze blood. "You can try," she said, "but dead space is mine now." Even as the warlord barked an order for weapons to lock on, his ship shuddered. The shadows enveloped it, slipping through its hull, silencing its crew one by one. The bridge crew of the Iron Claw watched in horror and awe as the warship was swallowed whole, vanishing without a sound or trace. Only empty space remained where it had floated moments before. Cassie leaned back in her chair, her eyes half closed once again, feeling the shadows settle around her like loyal hounds at her feet. The surviving bridge officers looked at her differently now. They understood that whatever she was not merely human. She was something far older, something dead space itself recognized and obeyed. Cassie turned to them, her voice soft but absolute, telling them that this was just the beginning. She promised that there would be more slavers, more empires who underestimated her kind, and that she intended to teach them all a lesson they would never forget. Somewhere deep in the ship, in a small corner of the engineering deck, the last of Vork's most loyal lieutenants huddled in fear, clutching a hidden communicator. He transmitted a final desperate message, not to the Khartan Empire but to someone else entirely. His voice trembled as he whispered that the girl had taken the ship, that she controlled the shadows, and that she was heading deeper into dead space. He ended the message with one last chilling warning before the shadows found him too: she is not what she seems, and her father is still out there. Cassie felt the transmission end, felt the shadow consume the traitor who had sent it, but she did not intervene. She wanted them to know. She wanted them all to know. Her eyes gleamed as she plotted the next jump, deeper into the heart of the darkness, her mind already preparing for the next confrontation. The Iron Claw was no longer a slaver ship. It was hers, and soon the galaxy would tremble in the knowledge that they had not just enslaved a human girl. They had awakened something far worse. The Iron Claw continued its slow glide deeper into dead space, where no sane ship traveled willingly. The stars outside had thinned until they were barely more than faint specks, swallowed by a vast cosmic abyss that seemed alive with whispers. On the bridge, Cassie sat in the captain's chair, her posture relaxed but her mind sharp, feeling every inch of her ship, every shadow that slithered along its corridors, obeying her will as effortlessly as breath. The remaining crew spoke in hushed tones, afraid even to glance her way. Their fear was not unfounded. Over the past day, several of them had vanished without a sound, their screams never heard, their shadows lingering strangely long before slipping away into nothingness. The atmosphere on board was thick with dread, but Cassie's calm presence kept the ship moving steadily forward, deeper into regions where space itself seemed warped and reality grew thin. In the slave hold, the former prisoners sat in uneasy silence, staring at the sealed door as though expecting it to open at any moment and swallow them whole. None dared speak of escape now. They had seen what the shadows could do, how they answered Cassie's quiet commands, how they could slip through vents and walls and take men without leaving a mark. Even the bravest among them kept their heads down, hoping that by showing obedience they might survive whatever was coming next. They whispered to one another that Cassie was not truly human, that something ancient had claimed her, that she was only a vessel now for some entity far more terrifying than any slave or captain. But despite their fear, none could look away from her when she passed, drawn to the quiet power that radiated from her, a reminder that she was both captor and protector, that no one else aboard the Iron Claw could keep them safe from dead space itself. Below deck, in engineering, the last of Vork's engineers worked frantically to stabilize the ship's systems. They no longer cared about their duties as slavers. Their only concern was survival. The reactor hummed strangely, its readings fluctuating in ways none of them could explain. The walls seemed to breathe in places, metal warping as though soft and alive, dark stains spreading where the shadows pooled thickest. Tools moved on their own, vanishing only to reappear hours later twisted into unrecognizable shapes. At first, the engineers had tried to ignore these signs, convincing themselves it was their imagination. But now they knew better. They could feel the eyes watching them from the shadows, waiting. Every moment felt like a test, and they knew they were failing. Cassie felt their fear, tasted it as clearly as if it were a tangible thing. The Shadowkeeper's voice murmured in her mind, telling her how easy it would be to crush them all, to let the shadows consume every soul aboard and pilot the ship alone through dead space forever. But she resisted that temptation. There was still purpose in their lives, still value in keeping a crew aboard, even one that hated and feared her. She needed witnesses, after all. Word of what she was becoming had to spread. Fear was a weapon, and it worked best when carried in the hearts of survivors. Suddenly, the proximity alarms blared, their shrill cry echoing through the bridge. The crew jumped to action automatically, but Cassie raised a hand, silencing them with a glance. The screens flickered and displayed a ghostly silhouette emerging from the darkness outside. A ship, ancient and corroded, drifting aimlessly but clearly on a collision course with the iron claw. Its design was unfamiliar, not carton, not human, not any species they recognized. Its hull was cracked and blackened, and strange symbols glowed faintly along its surface, pulsing as if alive. Cassie felt a thrill rise in her chest. The Shadow Keeper whispered that this was a remnant from a forgotten war, a derelict left to rot in dead space, and that there were things aboard it that should have remained buried. Without hesitation, Cassie ordered the ship to match trajectory with the derelict and prepare to dock. Her bridge crew hesitated only for a heartbeat before obeying, knowing better than to question her. As the docking clamps locked into place, Cassie rose from her chair, the shadows swirling around her feet like loyal dogs. She glanced over her shoulder at the crew, her expression unreadable, and informed them that she would be boarding the derelict personally. No one volunteered to accompany her. None needed to. They knew she preferred solitude, and they feared to walk at her side into that unknown darkness. Cassie moved through the corridors with a predator's grace, every shadow shifting to clear her path. The ship groaned around her, reacting to her presence as if it recognized its new master. When she reached the airlock, she paused for a moment, placing a hand against the cold metal. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing the derelict's interior, a gaping maw of darkness waiting to swallow her whole. She stepped inside without hesitation. Inside the derelict, the air was thick and stale, filled with a metallic scent of rust and decay. Strange markings covered the walls, glowing faintly as she passed, as if recognizing her presence. The floor was littered with debris, scraps of armor, and shattered weapons of unknown design. And then there were the bodies. Ancient corpses, humanoid but twisted and wrong, their bones elongated, their skulls cracked as if something had erupted from within them long ago. The shadows clung to every surface, and Cassie could feel them whispering to her, telling her stories of what had happened here, of experiments gone wrong, of creatures birthed from nightmares and abandoned when they became too dangerous to control. As she moved deeper, she found what she had been drawn to, a sealed chamber at the heart of the ship. The door was covered in runes that pulsed with a faint red glow, a warning to all who approached. Cassie ran her fingers across them, feeling the hum of ancient power beneath her skin. The Shadowkeeper's voice whispered eagerly in her mind, urging her to open the door, to claim what lay within. She smiled faintly, understanding now that this was no accident. The derelict had not simply drifted into her path. It had been waiting for her. With a thought, the shadows surged forward, seeping into the cracks and seams of the door, dissolving the locks and mechanisms in silence. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a darkened chamber lined with stasis pods, each one cracked and empty except for one at the center. Inside that last pod was a figure that looked almost human but not quite. Pale skin, too pale, stretched over a lean frame, and eyes that glowed faintly even behind closed lids. Cassie felt a shiver run down her spine, not of fear but anticipation. The Shadowkeeper whispered the truth then, the revelation that made her heart race. This was her father. He had come here long before, drawn by the same power, consumed by the same shadows that now served her. He had sealed himself in this pod when he could no longer control the hunger, waiting for someone strong enough to wake him. Cassie placed a hand on the glass and smiled. Her journey was only just beginning. The shadows stirred eagerly around her, sensing what was to come. The girl they thought was helpless had claimed a slaver's ship, conquered dead space, and now she was about to awaken the only thing in the galaxy that might rival her power. The darkness deepened around her as she whispered a single word and the stasis pod began to open. The hiss of ancient seals breaking filled the chamber as the stasis pod's glass panel slowly retracted, releasing a breath of cold mist that curled at Cassie's feet and merged effortlessly with the shadows already coiling around her. The figure inside did not move at first. His face was sharp and pale, unnervingly similar to hers, the same bone structure, the same dark hair that framed his features even in this death-like sleep. But his skin bore strange dark markings, shadowy tendrils etched into the flesh itself, as though the shadows she now commanded had made their home inside him long ago. The Shadowkeeper's whispers grew louder in her mind, rising into a chorus that sent chills down her spine. "He is awake now," they chanted, "awake because you called him." Cassie felt no fear as his eyes finally opened. They glowed faintly, a pale silver light that seemed ancient and knowing. For a moment they regarded her with unreadable silence, then slowly a smile touched his lips. His voice was soft but carried a weight that silenced even the shadows. "I was waiting for you," he said simply, as if it had all been inevitable. Cassie met his gaze, a thousand questions flashing through her mind, but she asked none of them. She knew the answers were unnecessary now. The shadows had drawn her here, led her step by step into this encounter, shaping her into something that could stand before this man, this creature, and meet him as an equal. Father and daughter, bound not by love or blood alone but by the darkness itself. Without a word, she extended her hand to him, and he took it, his fingers cold and strong. As he stepped out of the pod, the shadows recoiled momentarily from his presence, as if recognizing him as something older and darker than even themselves. Together, they walked back toward the docking hatch, the derelict ship groaning and creaking around them as if sighing in relief that its long vigil was finally over. The walls pulsed faintly with a sickly red light, and behind them, the stasis chamber's remaining pods cracked and crumbled, their contents long dead, their purpose fulfilled. As they crossed back onto the Iron Claw, Cassie's bridge crew fell silent at the sight of the stranger walking beside her. They did not dare ask who he was. They did not dare look too long into his eyes. The shadowy tendrils that swirled lazily around his feet were enough to warn them that this was no ordinary man. Cassie resumed her place in the captain's chair while her father stood behind her, a silent sentinel whose mere presence seemed to make the ship's metal walls tremble. The bridge felt smaller now, the air heavier. The crew awaited orders, but Cassie allowed the silence to stretch a little longer, savoring the weight of this moment. Her journey had shifted from mere escape and survival into something much larger. Dead space itself had become her domain, and now she commanded not just a haunted ship but a legacy, a force that had been waiting generations for someone strong enough to wield it. Her father spoke softly then, leaning close so that only she could hear him. He told her of what lay deeper still within dead space, of an ancient fortress abandoned when the First Empire fell, a place where the shadows had been birthed, and where their true power could be claimed. Cassie listened, her mind racing as images of conquest and domination flashed through her thoughts. The galaxy had laughed at humanity's weakness, at her weakness, but they would not laugh much longer. She ordered the crew to plot a course toward the fortress her father described. The navigator hesitated for just a second too long, and without needing to speak, the shadows responded for Cassie. They coiled around the navigator's throat, tightening until the alien choked out an apology and hastily entered the new coordinates. Cassie did not smile, did not gloat. She simply accepted this reaction as the natural order of things now. Her will was law aboard this ship, and soon, it would be law far beyond it. As the Iron Claw altered course, Cassie sensed a ripple in the shadows around her, a tremor of warning. A fleet was approaching. Carton warships, larger and more heavily armed than Vorik's vessel, had tracked the distress signals sent before her takeover and had followed her into dead space. Cassie rose slowly from her chair, her eyes narrowing as she watched the sensor data stream across the monitors. 10 ships, each bristling with weapons and carrying soldiers who believed they would rescue Vorik's lost crew and cargo. Cassie could almost hear them laughing already at the idea of retrieving a helpless human girl. She reached out with her mind, touching the shadows that stretched far beyond her hull now, spreading through dead space like roots. She could feel the cold emptiness around her, and she could feel the warships slicing into that emptiness, unaware of what awaited them. She felt her father's hand on her shoulder, steady and cold as stone, and his voice whispering that this would be a test, that the shadows hungered and would now prove their loyalty to her fully. Cassie turned to her crew, her voice calm and even, telling them to stand down and let her handle the situation. The bridge officers looked uncertain, but none dared speak. They simply lowered their heads and stepped away from their stations, leaving Cassie alone at the center of the bridge as the first Carton ship drew close. The comms systems lit up as the warship's commander demanded her immediate surrender, threatened to storm her ship and drag her back to Carton space in chains. Cassie let the commander speak, her expression unreadable, until his voice turned to insults and boasts about how weak humans were. When he finally paused, Cassie simply whispered one word into the void and the shadows answered. Outside the iron claw, dead space itself seemed to twist. The stars flickered and went dark. The shadows gathered like a storm, swirling around the Carton ships as they scrambled to react, their weapons locking on to phantom targets that vanished as quickly as they appeared. One by one, the warships were consumed, swallowed into the darkness without firing a single shot in defense. Their cries for help never reached anyone. The bridge crew stared in silence, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Only Cassie and her father remained calm, the shadows swirling around them, stronger than ever. Cassie sat once more, her expression serene as she ordered the ship forward, deeper into dead space, toward the ancient fortress that awaited them. The iron claw moved like a predator now, sleek and silent, leaving no trace behind. Cassie leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes briefly, savoring the moment. She was no longer a prisoner. She was no longer the helpless girl the slavers had dragged from her colony. She was something far more dangerous. The galaxy would learn soon enough. In the dark, her name would be whispered with fear and awe alike, and the shadows would ensure that no one ever underestimated humanity again. ChatGPT said. The iron claw slipped through the cold silence of dead space with a grace it had never known under Vorik's command. Cassie sat in the captain's chair, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp, absorbing every flicker of shadow that coiled around her feet and whispered through the dim air. The crew moved cautiously around her, careful not to meet her gaze, each one haunted by what they had witnessed. No one spoke unless spoken to, no one questioned her orders, and no one dared think of betrayal now. They all knew that even their thoughts might not be private in this place where shadows listened. The weight of what she had become pressed down upon them all, heavier than gravity itself, but for Cassie it felt almost natural, as if this path had always been hers to claim. Her father stood silently near the viewport, hands clasped behind his back, his presence a reminder that her journey had only just begun. Before them loomed the fortress, an ancient structure unlike anything recorded in any database or chart. It seemed to have grown from dead space itself, its spires jagged and black, its walls studded with alien symbols that glowed faintly in a sickly green light. No weapons bristled from its surface, but Cassie felt the power humming from it nonetheless. The shadows clung tightly around it as if afraid to trespass, yet they parted easily at her will as the iron claw approached. She stood slowly and crossed the bridge without a word, her father following just a step behind. The crew watched them go, each of them silently praying they would return but none daring to follow. At the docking port, Cassie paused only briefly, running her fingers over the ancient metal of the hatch that led into the fortress. The Shadowkeeper's voice echoed inside her mind, colder now, whispering of tests and trials that lay ahead, of the true legacy she would claim if she dared step inside. Without hesitation she triggered the hatch and the heavy door groaned open, revealing a passageway bathed in darkness even deeper than dead space itself. The shadows around her trembled with anticipation, and Cassie stepped through with her father at her side, leaving the iron claw behind. Inside, the fortress was silent and still, untouched by time. The walls were etched with symbols she could almost read now, the language of shadows and hunger that seemed to pulse with every step she took. Strange machines lined the halls, their purpose long forgotten, their surfaces coated in dust but their lights flickering faintly as she passed. The deeper she walked, the more she felt a presence surrounding her, watching her from every direction. Yet she felt no fear, only a calm certainty that this place belonged to her as surely as the shadows did. Her father spoke quietly as they walked, telling her fragments of truth, stories of those who had come before, of others who had tried and failed to master the fortress and the shadows it commanded. He told her that their family had once ruled this place, that they had walked these same halls, but had fallen when they could not control the hunger. She would not fall, he said softly, not if she embraced it fully. Cassie listened carefully, taking in every word, but her mind was already racing ahead, planning what she would do once this place was hers. At the heart of the fortress they found a chamber unlike any other, vast and circular, its floor inscribed with a glowing sigil that pulsed in time with Cassie's heartbeat. In the center stood a pedestal, and atop it a small stone, black as night and polished smooth, reflecting no light but casting a shadow deeper than any she had seen. The Shadowkeeper's voice grew louder now, urging her forward, telling her that this was the key, that this was the throne of shadows, and that only by claiming it would she truly command dead space. Her father stepped back as she approached, his expression unreadable, but his eyes fixed on her every movement. Cassie reached out, and her fingers closed around the stone. The moment she touched it, the fortress itself seemed to shudder. The shadows surged upward from the floor, swirling around her in a whirlwind of darkness, wrapping her in a cocoon of cold and silence. She felt them burrowing into her skin, her veins, her very bones, binding themselves to her completely. Pain flared through her for a moment, sharp and almost blinding, but she did not cry out. She embraced it, welcomed it, understanding that this was the price of true power. When the shadows finally withdrew, she stood taller, her eyes glowing faintly now with the same silver light she had seen in her father's gaze. She turned to him and saw pride in his expression, but also something else, something like fear. He knelt before her without a word, acknowledging that she had surpassed even him now. The fortress seemed to breathe around her, recognizing its new master, its walls pulsing gently as the sigils flared brighter. She felt her mind expand, stretching beyond her body and the fortress, reaching out into dead space itself, touching every shadow that drifted through the void. She saw then what she would do. The slaver empires had mocked humanity, had treated her people as weak and disposable, had stolen and sold them like cattle. No more. From this day forward, the shadows would carry her will. She would spread them through dead space and beyond, weaving them into the fabric of the galaxy itself. Every slaver who thought to exploit another human would find their ships lost, their fleets devoured, their worlds swallowed by darkness. She would make them fear the very space between stars. She spoke softly, a single command, and the fortress responded at once. Its ancient systems awoke fully, lights flaring across its surface as hidden engines began to hum. It was a ship as much as it was a fortress, a weapon waiting for a master. Cassie smiled as the fortress detached from its resting place and began to move, its immense bulk sliding smoothly through dead space, following her will as effortlessly as the shadows did. Her father rose beside her, but he said nothing. He understood that his role was done, that she no longer needed guidance. Together they returned to the Iron Claw, but Cassie knew that her true command lay with the fortress now. She would keep the Iron Claw as her flagship, a symbol of her rise, but the fortress would be her home, her throne. From its dark halls she would watch the galaxy and wait for the next foolish empire to underestimate humanity. As the Iron Claw and the fortress moved side by side through dead space, Cassie stood at the viewport and watched the shadows swirl beyond. They whispered to her still, but now their whispers were promises, not temptations. She smiled faintly, a quiet satisfaction settling over her. The girl they had captured, the helpless human they had mocked, had become the master of shadows and the ruler of dead space itself. And soon, very soon, the entire galaxy would remember her name,